In today's video, we're going to review My Life and Work, an autobiography of Henry Ford. I enjoyed this book, and it was nice reading from his perspective. Growing up, I had read a lot of history books concerning that time period and had learned a little bit about Henry Ford, but it was nice hearing his own perspective on how his business grew and what he believed about the world. Henry Ford was a businessman who believed that the U.S. was best served by business. He believed that the business-driven nature of America was the most natural and the most moral course for our nation. Knowing this, I had a few key takeaways from the book. It's not everything, of course. If you'd like to learn more, you can read the book yourself. But these are the 3 takeaways that I found truly impactful. My first takeaway from the book is that business should grow at the rate of sales. It was interesting reading this book after having read the John D. Rockefeller autobiography because it felt very much the opposite perspective of John D. Rockefeller. In Henry Ford's mind, a person shouldn't borrow in order to grow the business, but rather, as a business is able to sell product, that's the way in which it should grow. Henry Ford believed that the only time you should be borrowing is in the time that you have absolutely no need to be borrowing. In other words, throughout the course of his life, Henry Ford was not a fan of borrowing to develop a business. In a word, he really believed in a grassroots type of growth, that businesses ought to grow at the rate of sales. Now, this has a couple implications. This means that in order to grow larger, you need to become more efficient. You need to sell more. It also means that the ability of a business to pay wages is largely dependent upon how successful that business is. Thus, by having a very profit-driven company and very gradual developed progress, you ought to make sure that everything is sustainable in the business. Henry Ford was a big believer in sustainability and also a big believer in efficiency, which leads us to my second takeaway from the book. If a job is subdivided into small enough parts, then anybody who has the will to work ought to be able to work and provide for themselves and for their family. Moreover, your history shouldn't keep you from being able to work and provide for yourself. Henry Ford believed that anybody ought to have a chance to work. And not only that, that work ought to be fulfilling in not only financial means, but also its ability to give time off. Henry Ford believed that it would be better for a business to develop more efficient strategies of work than it would be to cut the quality of the products being delivered or to cut wages among the people who were working there. That as you drove down the efficiency of the business, those products would enter the marketplace at lower and lower costs, making it more widely available for everyday people. This was pretty important for Ford because at the time, cars were largely considered a luxury item that only the wealthy could have. And by creating an efficient way of making cars, Henry Ford was inviting everyone in America to be able to have their own automobile. But more than that, he believed that if the same tenets of efficiency were applied to other industries, such as the farming industry, that all of our products and services would go down in cost, and that everyone in the nation would be able to afford more and have more rich and full lives. And this leads me to my final takeaway, which is be aware of who's telling the messages. In Henry Ford's time, there was war, there was talks of unions, and there was talks of rich and poor. In all those categories, Henry Ford talked about people who were arising, that were delivering messages, but those folks were actually benefiting more than the everyday person. Talking of unions first, Henry Ford noticed that there were a lot of unions among industrial activities. And he even noticed a couple of people trying to enter his business and drum up support for unions. But he believed that his way of doing things, his way of paying people high wages and providing a regular time frame of work with 8-hour work days, that it was in the best interest of his employees and his best interest of the business itself for them to proceed as they were going. During his time, unions did not take hold because in a lot of ways he was providing the best service for his employees and his employees were providing the best service for him and for the business. Henry Ford believed that in a lot of cases, unions were really good for a very small amount of people at the very top of the unions. And that oftentimes they didn't actually help the people they professed to help, but they provided exceeding wealth to the people who ran the unions. In the same way, Henry Ford talked a little bit about war profiteering and how during the time of World War I, the people who had stirred up this fear around an impending world war, the war to end all wars, that those people were benefiting by selling products to the people who were afraid, selling artillery and other services to countries that were stirred up by this dramatic event occurring all over. Those were the people that were benefiting, not the people on either side of the war. Henry Ford believed that peace and not war is good for business. Peace is where things happen in the business world. Peace is where we're able to drive down costs and create a more rich life for everyone across nations. And lastly, addressing the poor and the rich. In Henry Ford's time, 100 years ago, he noticed that there was a very small category of Americans who were very wealthy, and of which he was one. And there was a very small category of people who were so poor that they could not afford daily necessities. In between those two pillars, there's a large category of Americans who are neither rich nor poor. But oftentimes, there are people who try to stir up a sort of divide between that middle class. And they convince people in the middle to align themselves with either the poor or the rich, and to create this conflict. And this conflict actually isn't good for any of us. We see the same divide today on the political front, and it really makes me wonder, who is profiting from these arguments? The point of all this discussion is not to stir up more anger, but to say to be aware of who's telling the messages, because often those people are benefiting it from the most and hurting everyone else in the process. All this to say, Henry Ford was a big believer in work and allowing everyone in America the opportunity to be able to succeed and to have a full life worth living. With that said, that's the end of the video. If you liked it, please give it a big thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing down below, and I will see you in the next video.
Totally.